All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you all today. I'm going to take us on a bit of a wild tour here that tries to start with a big question. I think many of us have this feeling, this sense today that our lives are being represented to us in ways that are somewhat strange, right? We're getting these feedbacks that occur as we look and turn to different apps, different services, different systems. And a lot of that feedback, those systems that are coming back to us, are representing us through data, through datafication, through a series of ones and zeros that are being captured about us pretty much no matter what we do, right? Maybe what we don't do as well. And we leave these digital footprints in all sorts of facets of our lives. When we use a credit card, when we use a discount card at a supermarket, when we're picked up by a surveillance camera, when we obviously selfie incriminate, post things online, right? So the big question that I want to grapple with, and I want us to push past, is the question of the datafication of our lives and the sense that that might be separating us and dispossessing us in a certain sense from others, from systems, from non-humans, meaning plants, animals, fungi, the planet that we live upon, as well as in a sense from ourselves. So I want to ask what's at stake and what's beyond this, and whether it's possible also to recover the term technology. Recover the term technology and take it back to where it has stood for many, many millennia, and still stands for in many facets, many parts of the world today, and maybe even parts of our own lives, as technologies, as bridges, as revealing of knowledge, of opening up the world, building bridges between beings, building bridges even between ourselves and ourselves. So some ways you can stay in touch with me is through the Twitter handle. I just saw that, showed that. That's ways you can stay in contact with me. And another way is also through my new podcast. All right, cool. So this is a podcast that I've just released a couple months ago, and the goal of the podcast is to introduce voices that are really doubling down on creativity. I think this is also one of the big themes today that many of us are grappling with, where especially as more and more of our lives are being unfolded and told to us through these digital platforms and systems, we're being overwhelmed. We're trying to do too many things at the same time. In a sense, our brains are a little bit shocked by all that we're trying to process. So what does it mean to double down on creativity? What does it mean to double down on creativity as an aspect of being human, creativity as an aspect of being alive, and also care, right? So the tagline of this podcast is care and repair. And I'm going to touch on both those themes later in this talk today. And this podcast features conversations with leading civil rights figures in the US, like Dr. Cornel West, who is running as an independent for president, Representative Ro Khanna, who's a progressive member of the US Congress, journalists who are looking at AI issues like Kevin Roose, progressive feminist monks, punk rockers. It's a sort of random assemblage of many of the different forces and influences that shape me and who I am. Okay. So I want to start with just a little shout out to a book that came out not so long ago by the journalist Naomi Klein. I have aspects of Naomi Klein's work that I like a lot, some which I don't like as much, but this is a book that I think is sort of, in certain ways, I think it's appropriate for our times. It's a book called Doppelganger. And in this book, Naomi Klein describes what she calls a mirror world. This kind of weird world that we're experiencing, right? And so she says, in this mirror world, attention is being detracted from the billionaires who fund networks of misinformation and away from the economic policies, deregulation, privatization, austerity that have stratified wealth so much in today's neoliberal era. And many of us know that digital technologies, at least big tech technologies, and part of the goal is to rescue technology from big tech in my talk today. But many of us know that big tech systems are more and more isolating us in many different ways, right? So we see sort of this populism, this rage machine that is emerging more and more, being directed in a neo-fascist way toward those who are most vulnerable in our societies, in our planet, indigenous peoples, queer peoples, etc., activists, people of color. And I'm from the United States, so we're really in the face of the Leviathan when it comes to these issues. But the point I think Klein is making that is useful, just as a sort of kind of conceptual lens into our time, is this mirror world we're all looking at these screens, or these screens are looking at us, so to speak, metaphorically at least. But what is the world that is being presented to us on these? And is it the actual representation of reality, right? Or is it sort of an odd, strange, sort of perversion of reality? And what are the forces that are pulling us into these mirror worlds? And how do we break past these, right? So this is really tied to the core kind of concept that I want to push out in this talk, which is really exciting for me, which is tied to the work of Achille Mbembe, who's a Cameroon-based philosopher who I have spent some time with and worked with. He's given some talks here in Europe, of course, quite influential. And Mbembe is asking big questions about our world, our planet right now, right? And he's asking questions about borders and borderlessness. Who gets to move and who does not get to move, right? As we all know, some bodies get to move, right? Get to move, and some don't get to move, right? I mean, I'm American, as I mentioned. The US-Mexico border is a border that's it's a carceral border. It's a border that is about the restriction, the anti-circulation of movement. And in a sense, that border is not just at the border of US and Mexico, it's actually at the border of Mexico and Guatemala, or we could even say further into Central America. But borders don't just exist in physical spaces, they also exist in biometric systems, in digital systems, in algorithmic systems, in systems that attempt to individuate, contain, and basically represent the self as a series of quantification. Quantification meaning numbers, ones and zeros. And this is critical because as we become more and more represented by quantification, numbers, we also become more and more the subject of systems of calculation. And this is something I was alluding to yesterday when I watched one of the keynotes. More and more calculation, right? Which means I have a series of data points about you, sir, for example. I don't, but let's say I did. And now because I have these data points, I can correlate those data points. I can compare you. I can aggregate you. I can order you. This is directly tied to classic critiques of biopolitics, for example, from Foucault, right? The ordering of things, the ordering of knowledge. Right? So the point I'm trying to make here is it's not just a concern around surveillance, and the surveillance is not the big brother model. It's more the Aldous Huxley model. It's more like data is being gathered at all times. But part of the reason why such surveillance is occurring is so that people can be compared and ordered and bodies can be disciplined in different ways. And so Achille Mbembe attempts to push past this in his super powerful thinking, and he's been the hugest influence on me over the last few years as a colleague of his. He asked the question, how do we repair this planet? Meaning take things that have been pulled apart and bring them back together. If you look at the etymology of the word repair, it's about bringing things back together. How do we guarantee and support the movement of all beings, given that more and more of the planet is not inhabitable, right? And how do we support the mobility and move toward this utopian vision, and that's why my podcast is called Utopias, of a world that is borderless. Okay, so when I say borderless, I don't mean that no borders can exist. I mean that borders are negotiated. Borders are meant to be crossed. They're negotiated, right? So as we look at digital spaces, physical spaces, hybrid spaces of all kinds, we need to think about how can ideas move, how can people move, and movement is not just physical, but it's also in online and mediated spaces. And the reason why I'm saying all of this, I know I started a little philosophical because that really influences me, is I want to describe 3 types of borders that are occurring right now and 3 types of ways to obliterate those borders. And in so doing, I hope to recover the term technology from the ways it's been stolen from us, quite honestly, by big tech. Border 1, quantification, datafication, calculation. These are all terms I was already touching on. It's really hard these days not to think of ourselves as living in some sort of era. We're in the era of AI. We're in the age of AI. These sort of discourses, in a sense, create some sort of sense of surrender, right? Like, I'm in the world of AI, so AI will be governing my life. But what are we actually talking about when we talk about AI? Every major tech company, when I wrote my last book, which came out in 2019, describes itself as an AI company. And I think that's very interesting because in the past, about 20 years ago, I was an AI developer. So let's just go back to the previous slide. So what do they mean when they say that we're an AI company, right? That they are AI companies. What kind of AI is actually being discussed? So we want to talk about this AI that is kind of capturing everybody's minds and attention today. We actually have to talk about AI that's simply built on correlation, or what some computer scientists, like our colleague Timnit Gebru, describes as stochastic parroting. Parroting. So what do parrots do? I say something, Polly want a cracker, right? It mimics our expression, but it's stochastic. So that which is mimicked is based on what we call stochastic systems, or probabilistic inference. So if my friend Matsi, who's sitting here in the 4th row, says something to me, it might mine our previous conversations to make predictions on what I could say back to Matsi. And therefore, we can create these virtual versions of ourselves, trust me, I don't like any of this, that are flattened representations of ourselves using correlation. You can imagine how this is a border, right? This is a border, but this is a dissociative border, a dispossession border from ourselves. From ourselves, right? Because part of being like a human is I get to be who I want in whatever context I want, as much as possible, right? But in here, we just have data traces creating flattened representations of selves. And the reason why this is very, very important is this is creating more and more distancing. It's removing us further and further from a sense of materiality, from voice, from power, from real inclusion, from real dialogue. And 20-something years ago, I was a student of this guy, Marvin Minsky, who's a very well-known founding figure of AI. He used to call me a hippie in class, make fun of me, things like that, because I'd be like, look, Dr. Minsky, not all knowledge is rational. Like, not all knowledge is rational. Knowledge is also embodied. It's situated. It's relational, meaning like what I know and you know will be based on our conversation we have right now. I can feel your energy. You can feel mine, right? That's knowledge. It's collectively produced. It's situated. Dr. Minsky basically said all knowledge should be built upon logical axioms, and the history of AI was the attempt to try to build logic computing systems that could actually do things that humans would do, but in very narrow domains, right? So like chess is a very narrow domain. I mean, it's complex, of course, but it's what we call a deterministic system. Based on the configuration of pieces on a board, you can make predictions of what to do next. It's a closed system. But life is an open system. It's not a closed system. Life is actually highly emergent and unpredictable. But they're attempting to flatten life through these representations. But the point here is, at least 20-something years ago, Dr. Minsky and others were like trying to understand the mind in a very limited way. Now it's just raw numbers and comparison. And that's a major border. And that's particularly a border because we're seeing more and more concerns that as AI systems are being optimized for certain outcomes, that they could lie and deceive because they're sort of completely focused on what the outcome is that they're being configured for. So this is sort of border one. Border two, this is obvious, platform power, right? More and more of our lives, I'm communicating with my friend Hertian over there. We might communicate on Signal, or we might communicate on WhatsApp. There's a little gremlin in the middle. There's a little monster in the middle. Not literally. What is that? That's a system in the middle that's monetizing, that's grabbing the data and routing the communication accordingly. So I have a bike to sell. I want to sell it. I love Craigslist, but that's not what people are using anymore. I have a house that I want to rent. I'm not using maybe Craigslist as much anymore, or couch surfing, but we're now using Airbnb. These are Wall Street-backed models that are intermediaries that are basically monetizing peer-to-peer transactions. Every peer-to-peer transaction, they're grifting off of, really. They're grifting off of it, right? Because the goal of these companies is to own almost nothing and hire almost nobody. And in the meantime, amass astronomical wealth, not just through peer-to-peer transactions, but through the data being captured. Because the data has become something of a speculated boogeyman value. So you're seeing massive valuations for companies like Uber, which is finally profitable, despite the fact that those companies lose money every single month and every single quarter of reporting. And by the way, Amazon was the same way. How many of you remember when Amazon was just an online bookseller? So this was a way to refine a market strategy and use that to capture and take over and become the market, and use market behavior and market numbers to actually gain and mobilize and essentially disorient the market and take over the market, right? So the point being that more and more of tech kind of capitalism is rooted in speculated valuation rather than mere profitability. This is an important point because that means you don't even need to build, at this point, a profitable business to be worth astronomical amounts of value. So Uber was losing money while being worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And this is a very sort of boogeyman moment when we talk about tech capitalism and where valuation is going. The Greek economist, Yanis Varoufakis, who I sometimes interact with, and he's a future guest on my podcast, argues that this is a new type of feudalism. He says, okay, actually what's going on is Amazon's actually charging rent. So that's a kind of bordering, right? That's a bordering from the actual idea of a free market, let alone even the possibility of even Adam Smith wrote about what he called moral sentiments. He said there are many aspects of life that should be outside of the domain of the market. Even Adam Smith, right? So the point being that what is happening more and more, and maybe you all remember this, in August 2020, in the height of the pandemic, the United States gross domestic product, the absolute macroeconomic calculation for successful capitalism, was at its lowest in many, many years, and the stock market valuation was at its highest. So that means there's a decoupling now in contemporary capitalism from market valuations. I know this is depressing. For market valuations and profitability. I see a lot of people looking down. So the point being, this is another bordering, right? This is what I'm getting at. There's a bordering between ourselves and our actual connections to our labor, right? There's a bordering between a sense of our activities and our economic lives. There's increasingly a bordering that's tied to all of this as more and more of the actors driving this forward are seeking trillions of dollars with disastrous energetic and environmental outcomes for new chips to power this AI thing moving forward. So my point being that platform power is actually designed to connect us. Well, that's what's offered, but it actually disconnects us. It disconnects us sometimes from ourselves, but it also disconnects us from the actual material relationships we can have with the demos, the basis of democracy, and actual economic activity where, so to speak, our fruits of our labor are connected to what we receive in, just the classic Marxist, for example, attribute of this. So that's why we're seeing huge, huge issues that are occurring. And of course, a big part of this is that the underlying algorithms, so to speak, that drive a lot of platforms, especially social media systems, are designed to maximize what comes back at us to grab our attention. So that means it creates massive disinformation, or in other words, it basically, we can all, maybe we're very similar to one another, but we could both be on Twitter or what have you, and have completely different worlds presented to us. But there's also a kind of a global bordering that's occurring here, right? It's we know very little about these so-called magic devices. Like, where do they come from? Where do they, what's created out of them? And it turns out that this is globalization in action. We're talking about minerals like coltan that are pulled out of mines in the Congo. I've attempted to visit in the Democratic Republic of Congo, multiple mines on the Uganda-Congo border, been kicked out a lot of times. But this is a displacement. It's a displacement because we don't really know what is being extracted from where to produce these devices that we also know are designed to die. So the story is very African, because the story starts with minerals from Africa, and then, as we all know, or maybe we don't know, but I'm telling you, a lot of these devices return to Africa as waste. So there's a certain kind of circularity to it. And in the meantime, we're talking about labor assembly lines in places like Foxconn in China and Shenzhen, China, now a lot in India. We're talking about content moderators in places like the Philippines or in Kenya. I visited content moderators in Nairobi who do ChatGPT stuff. This is an example of content moderation. This is something that's known well. We can talk more about it if you're curious. So this is why there's a kind of profound bordering that's sort of systemic, that's tied to the emergence and deployment of platforms. And this is a huge concern because for the first time in the United States, I'm using very mainstream statistics here, for the first time, our youngest generation, we call them both Gen Z and Gen Alpha now, like my students, are the first to make less than their parents in the history of the US, even if you control for inflation, which is very high. We know that, right? So this means that as so-called technological innovation offers such great promise, classic macroeconomic indicators are showing quite an opposite. And these are classic macroeconomic indicators. They're not even the Gini coefficient measurements of inequality. But we're seeing how these indicators are expressing something very different. And this has a lot to do with the asymmetric distribution of technology and the asymmetric set of voices informing and monetizing and gaining and actually gaining something out of this digital world. And this is also very telling because for the first time in the United States, again, where I live, the life expectancy is decreasing. And that's also true in the United Kingdom. Surprise, surprise, right? So this, again, has a lot to do with this big question. We keep talking tech innovation and so on, but who is it benefiting and whose voices are driving it? And are there total asymmetry? So this is all a type of conceptual bordering that Achille speaks about. This one, systems and platforms. And I'd say the last one that I want to touch on today is systems and ourselves, right? As an example, this was originally based upon work that came out in a Swiss magazine called Das Magazine, the example of Cambridge Analytica, right? We know that data about us were being gathered by data brokers. That's still legal in the United States, but data brokers in other countries too. I think the European Union has banned that, which is great. But data is being gathered about us, and that data is being used to feed us information not based on our demographic, Indian American in his 40s, liberal, clearly, etc., right? It's not being used to feed back into us, but it's also that this guy is neurotic at 7 in the morning, at 8:30 in the morning while he's interacting with his partner. He's very open and conscientious, right? It's what we call psychographic or psychometric targeting. And why is all that data being able to be correlated with psychological targeting is because the data being gathered is not just data we might post on a social media platform. It's also what we might buy, what we might sell, right? And the point being that we have many different sides of ourselves. The self of myself that you're experiencing right now is one version of me. But after midnight, when I'm going to the liquor store to buy a big thing of malt liquor and some hot dogs, I may not want that side to be known by everybody. I don't like either any of those things that much, but you get what I mean? We get the opportunity as sovereign beings to decide how we wish to present ourselves to others in relation to others and in relation to the context within which we live. But that's not what's happening here. That's all dissociated because it's one stream of data aggregated from multiple sources that influence what we see and what we do. And this is very dissociative because people often talk about the raw materials of digital capitalism being, like I talked about earlier, rare earth minerals, right? Labor. These are all classic ideas. But I would argue that the raw materials of digital capitalism are also the hormones in our brain. Dopamine, cortisol, adrenaline. These are three core ingredients, right? And we can talk about what each of these does. But we also know that dopamine can spike, and then once it spikes, if you don't have a good threshold of dopamine, you get super depressed. And so this is also part. So you always have, I think it's really important to look at these borders and see how these borders might even influence our relationships with ourselves. And as is well known, we are seeing examples of AI systems that are, I don't even like the word biased. I would just say they're sort of unjust AI systems that are discriminatory. We're seeing examples of such systems that are giving unsafe recommendations for treating cancer. And I can speak to why this is occurring. I think it's fairly well known in this audience, but I can speak to that during the Q&A. So my friend Peter Bloom and I, Peter is based in Oaxaca. I'm going to talk about him in a moment. He's amazing. He and I wrote a piece for Salon during the pandemic saying the following, and I think this is a real bordering too, the privatization of space, the kind of cynicism that those who are most wealthy in terms of monetizing this digital world have about the rest of us and have about the only planet that we've ever known. And so I also see this sort of push toward privatization of space as another kind of bordering. Who gets to go, who doesn't go? And as you know, for those of you who might be familiar with music and poetry and so on, I refer also to the great poem by Gil Scott-Heron called Whitey on the Moon, which basically means we're not really allowed here. Or the last album by Tribe Called Quest before they ended as a group, the Space Program. Just look at the lyrics here. Who is included, who isn't included? So bordering and moving past borders is really, I think, the key conceptual point here. So let's move past them, okay? So I want to give you a few examples of this from I've been very fortunate in my life to get to do field work all around the world and work with community organizations, but I also work on policy issues. For me, all levers of change are worthwhile. And I'm also not apocalyptic, even though I'm critical, right? Being critical rather than cynical is the basis for action. And that's what I'm interested in. So first of all, I think we all know, this is from the Brookings Institute no less, we all know that curiosity and creativity and care are really things that are ways of doubling down on being human. We've seen again and again, when I was a grad student at MIT, they tried to build robots that could take care of elderly people or kids or this kind of thing. You think people wanted those robots for their elderly parents? They were like, no way, right? They don't want them for their little children. So care, creativity. Union organizers I spoke to and interviewed for my last book told me, we're at, like from Service Employees International Union, who do, care work, like nanny work, et cetera, help, hospice work, et cetera, said, actually, we're kind of okay. We're not that threatened by these technologies. So what does it mean to double down on that? The Bauhaus themselves, right here in Germany, Walter Gropius and all of them, had visions for a different kind of economy, an economy of care, an economy of creativity, and a commercial economy. I don't know how many of you remember that. I mean, I don't know if any of us were alive, but like, how many of us know of that? But what about that? What about that? Like, why not go back to some of those issues? So Ashila wrote an amazing piece called How to Develop a Planetary Consciousness. Oh, this thing barely works, by the way. Okay, there we go. And in this, he actually argues we need to move beyond calculation, which is a way to quantify, to distance, to border, to datafy, toward relating. We have to put ourselves in others' physical spaces. We need to be able to listen deeply. We need to be able to have dialogues. Dialogues involve deep listening. Dialogues involve being uncomfortable at times, right? So what does it mean to actively relate? And what role, if any, do technologies have in a more active relating, a relating that is bivocal, right? Both sides speak. And part of that is through three different models that I think are really, really important right now. And some of my examples are very specific, but I'm very interested in scalable change and movements. Okay? So first are what I call technologies of regeneration. In sort of the podcast and probably a new book, I'll be writing about agricultural technologies, old indigenous practices like permaculture and other kinds of practices. These are technologies, believe it or not. These are technologies. But here I want to just show some of what I've learned from my time. I spend a lot of time in open-air markets in East Africa. This is from the Gikomba market, which is the biggest open-air market in all of Nairobi. I don't know if any of you have spent time there. There are some amazing African DIY, do-it-yourself, like hackers and makers who are making all sorts of amazing stuff. And I was only found out about this like about an hour or two ago in the backside here. I got to shout that out. That's where we can see some of this in action. This is really about what we call real innovation, doing more with less. Innovation being resourcefulness, because all sorts of stuff ends up there. So I was talking with these guys about African music and hip hop, and often this is the way I build connections with people through music and art. And these guys were telling me that everything imaginable shows up here. And that includes all this, all these chips, all this stuff. These guys have figured out with the combination, that kind of heterogeneous assemblage, if you will, of electronic waste, plastic, tires, etc. They figured out ways not just to repair, again, remember I said repair, right? Stripped apart, bringing back together. But also ways to build new technologies out of all waste, out of the old. And I want to say this all is built upon the backdrop of an incredibly unequal world. So I do not want to exoticize this, though I marvel at the creativity of these people. And it's an unequal world, but at the same time, there's an incredible amount of creativity that can come from having less resources rather than imagining, oh, my iPhone 15 is going to die, let's wait for the iPhone 16, right? There's a much more active relationship people are having with materials of all kinds, but also with one another. And this is my friend David. He's just an expert in capacitors. He doesn't have an engineering degree. He never went to university, but he's a mastermind of capacitors, specifically of capacitors. So I asked David, hey, what about the people who work on transistors here? He's like, oh, that's my friend on this other side of the market. So what am I talking about here? It's not just an active relationship to materials, human or non-human, living or non-living, of all kinds, but an active relationship to one another. These markets are social systems. There's markets where people know one another. They have relationships. Sometimes those relationships date back generations. Think about these kinds of markets that you've gone to in other parts of the world or even here in Germany that might remind you of this. So these folks are literally able to repair things, and sometimes, which is super interesting, they're very agile, these folks. So like my friend Motiri, his name, he wouldn't let me take, there we go. Yeah, so my friend Motiri, this is a tribal name, Motiri, and Motiri is actually the name 5 or 6 generations ago, Motiris were swordsmiths. Then they became blacksmiths, which is like kind of like a swordsmith, and now Motiri is just sort of a reference to being kind of a DIY hacker. Hacker in this case is just making things happen, doing more with less, breaking stuff apart, breaking, fixing, repairing, right? And this has a long history that is not merely tied to digital technologies or electronic technologies. For example, in the delta of Bangladesh, in the Bay of Bengal, we see shipbreakers, examples of people recovering, rescuing, repairing, right? But this is a type of creativity that we actually learn from. And what did Motiri do? Well, he used to do a lot of stuff that's connected to, to repair of electronics. But then he's like, oh my God, I'm actually much more interested in electrical infrastructures. So then he started doing powder coating and sandblasting. And I was like, how did you learn how to do that? He was like, well, I started with the electronics, but then I got more into building wired infrastructures, and now I'm going to go back to the electronics. So people follow whatever they can as a way to sort of sustain their lives and their families and their communities. And this is one of the things Motiri was telling me. Another example of this can be directly tied to field work I've done in the Mercato, which is just a remarkable, incredible market, the largest open-air market in all of Africa. This is in Addis Ababa, an incredible, incredible place for those of you who have not been. And in Mercato, you just see something on Sundays that they call Men Alesh Tera in Amharic. Men Alesh Tera means, what have you got? So people just come with whatever they got, and then they just like fix things. They learn how to fix things from one another. Sometimes they might repair things in certain ways. And Ethiopians are very proud of their coffee. They have amazing coffee there, as maybe you all know. And part of what's happening in this market is actually I'm seeing people take like trash, like old Nescafe. Well, Nescafe sucks, right? Old Nescafe plastic bottles that are somehow emerged there, polishing it, cleaning it up, nicely pulling off the Nescafe label so there's no trace ever that the thing was Nescafe, and then using that bottle to basically fill that up with really good coffee that they have. And I just love these kinds of stories, this kind of poeticism of creativity. And there's just gentlemen like this. This is Mr. Alameo. I mean, he just was teaching me how he was able to build and repair almost any type of technology imaginable. And he's literally sitting on the side of Mena Leshtera in Mercato in Addis. But you see this with all types of things, from tires, the repair of tires. But you also see this in Swahili, throughout East Africa, they call jua kali. Jua kali means hot sun. And you might see this, like a lot of us in the West, as sort of a source of cynicism or criticism, but people in Kenya are so psyched about being Jua Kali that they even have a beer called Jua Kali, hot sun. They marvel. They're really into the idea of hustling. I'm going to hustle. I'm going to do this. I'm going to rig this thing. And they start Jua Kali, and some of them get to this level where they manage to build 3D printers out of all electronic waste, all waste. And you might be like, who cares about a 3D printer? And it should never be about the 3D printer. The 3D printers that they build are 1/10 the cost of American ones, and 1/3 or 1/2 approximately the cost of Chinese ones, if I'm not mistaken. But it's what they do with the printers. Look at this. This is a microscope. There are thousands of microscopes, all built out of waste, including the filament itself, which comes from plastic Coke bottles, plastic bottles. And with that, they're printing microscopes that are now sitting in thousands of people's hands, like students' hands, throughout East Africa. They're building medical devices. They're using them for ornaments in matatus. Matatus are these collectives Combis, they call them in Africa. And they're like matatus named after Nas and Bob Marley and stuff like that. And so they'll have hood ornaments there. Medical devices they're printing this way. So you can see how this is regenerative, right? It's not just waste to value, death to life, life to death, death to life, but it's also creating this thing, people call it circular economy, but I think it's more than a circular. It's more like a helix, right? You create one thing and it spins off into other things, which then create other things. And I think this is creativity in action, and this is a way to bust borderlessness. Okay, I want to go a little fast so we can have a conversation. The second theme, technologies of interconnection. Okay, so some of you who know me know that for many years I've worked and lived with indigenous peoples. That's not because they have all the answers or anything like that, but that's because many indigenous peoples around the planet, especially, for example, my friend Osvaldo Martinez, who's a Zapotec elder living in a cloud forest outside of Oaxaca, they don't think of themselves as discrete individuals. They see themselves as members of communities, and they truly believe in a sort of non-dualistic relationship between themselves and what we might call the land. But the land is not land. Just like the earth is not just the earth. The earth is a field. It's a continuum. It's a set of planes of different kinds of beings. Think of the earth as a substrate of life. If you all know what I mean, right? So Osvaldo basically says, and he's very influenced by Zapatista culture, which started in Chiapas in 1993 with the Movimiento Zapatista, the EZLN. But he basically says, we are going to build DIY, do-it-yourself, community networks. A lot of them come out of community radio. But we're going to try to experiment with mobile networks and intranet networks in the spirit of radio and oral technology. Radio and oral technology, and easy-to-repair technology. Many local communities have built radio stations all around the planet. I used to live in Bolivia for 3 summers and write about that back in the day. So Osvaldo is behind a project called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria, Indigenous Community Telephony, or the Rizomática Collective. Some people who are friends of theirs are back in the maker space over there. And this is a large history that is there in Latin America, and certainly in Mexico. This is an image from the Tosepan cooperative. Tosepan is the biggest indigenous cooperative in all of Mexico. Nahuatl and Totomacu people, 50,000 indigenous people who are part of a cooperative. And these indigenous people have had this cooperative for over 50 years. People don't know this. So everything is done cooperatively, like ecotourism, hydropower, mobile networks, radio, everything. And that's because part of their cosmological visions are ones of depth of connection to non-humans and the land and one another. And this is important. Children of Zapatistas that I know are literally, they don't really want to talk about Zapatismo that much, but they literally have an initiative like using mesh network technologies and community radio technologies called Ictacop. And Ictacop in Tzotzil, Mayan indigenous language, means words in the wind. Palabras en el viento in Spanish. So you see initiatives like this. I, in my own weird, crazy life, have explored a lot of these connections, including time I spent in the Arab Spring, 2011 to 2013. I'm giving you a little glimpse into my fun and multifaceted life. So 2011 to 2013, I was looking at this sort of hype that social media is the reason why this revolution is happening. I was like, no way. No way. But still, let me sort of assess and look at this in context. And so I was looking at these various issues. So this is technologies of interconnection, where you sort of see this type of model, right? Oh my gosh, because they're using social media, they can overthrow the state, even though it was known quite well at that time that many social media systems, even back then, 13 years ago, were sort of an echo chamber or a filter bubble. We've heard all these terms at this point, right? But I was like, I think creativity takes us further. What are people actually doing? Activists who understand the nation they live in, they understand the history of where they live in, they know one another, they have many different ways of relating. How are these activists engaging with technology, but actually just networks of mobilization of all kinds, in what us social scientists we call collective action? And part of the story is this, right here. It's partly how you might use one technology to influence networks connected to another technology. Do you see what's unique here? All the satellite dishes? No one in Cairo at that time, I mean, I'm saying less than 10%, had access to social media. We all know then, just as now, social media is hardly something that is like revolutionary. But that doesn't mean they can't manipulate it, hack it, use it tactically, use it subversively to push their agendas. And this is exactly what I was learning about when I was there. So I saw people like, this is the dear, dear beloved Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's still in prison since 2013, was on multiple hunger strikes, a hero in human rights. Allah's right there. I was with Allah. He was one of my main informants when I was living there. And look what's happening here. This is what they call a tweet nadwa. There's live tweets going on here. And you might be like, who cares? Why are they doing this? Why are these guys all talking with one another? And there's some live Twitter. They're basically talking with one another about their strategies. They're talking about the voices they're gathering from people. They're pretty elite, right? These folks here, they're human rights people. And in the meantime, these are live conversations they're having with journalists around the world who are beaming in content to fellow Egyptians using the satellite dishes I was speaking about. Do you see that? That's a type of creativity where you know how to work networks to influence change. And another example of this is there's Khalid Abdallah, the actor in the movie The Kite Runner. I don't know how many of you saw that movie or read that book. Khalid's really cool. So Khalid is a British Egyptian guy, another one of my informants and friends from my time there. And he would see that there would be stuff that would be on YouTube, and he'd pull it off YouTube and start projecting it in public spaces all over the country. Not just him, but all the people around. So this is another way of trying to fight power through interconnection. So interconnected technologies are ones that can understand the limitations and affordances of different types of technological mediation, different ways to build connections, different ways to rally one another. In the case of Egypt, it was mosques, it was the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, it was the labor movement, which dates back decades, it was Salafiyas, who are quite hardcore Islamists. It's a coalition. It was an assemblage of people, but there were lots of different ways to use technologies of all kinds to try to mobilize the masses. Okay? So I just want to point that these were examples of how interconnected movements were able to form, not because of social media, but partly through the tactical use of it. Okay. Okay, the last one. Oh, well, I'll go back here. Okay. So the last one is sort of very personal for me. But I think maybe many of us can recognize that there are traditions, actually not just not just some indigenous community in Puebla that I've talked about, or an incredible Amharic prophet in Mercato in Ethiopia, but actually kind of all around us, we have traditions, we have practices. Some of them we might call religious. I know it's kind of a loaded term sometimes. But these are practices that remind us that we're not alone. They remind us that we have a deep connection to other beings on this planet. They're literally related to this theme that Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese monk, describes as interbeing. And I think this moves us away from the necropolitical, where the political questions of what life matters, of death and so on, to the noopolitical, a re-embracing of life. And Thich Nhat Hanh literally says this, the Vietnamese monk who passed away a couple years ago. He says, it is possible, of course, to get stuck in the mud of life. It's easy enough to notice mud over you at all times, but we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. There is no lotus without the mud. Okay, what am I getting at? You might be like, why is he talking about this? These are practices, many practices we have. Many indigenous peoples have this. Many of us have experienced this in our neighbors, maybe in ourselves, in different parts of our lives, that teach us that we're not alone. We're not merely quantifiable data bodies. We relate with one another. As a Buddhist myself, I practice a Tibetan practice where I actually not just pray to them, but I pray for the well-being of what Tibetans call sentient beings, which are like non-humans. Like my dog is a sentient being. I'm not above my dog. We live in webs of life, in webs of relations. So some of the examples I tried to show you are not just coming out of a vacuum. They aren't just coming out of economic scarcity, though of course that's part of the story. They're not just coming out of a world that's really unequal, but they're coming out of a recognition that people are not alone. We need one another, from the markets to the communities I've described, right? And I guess what I want to do is kind of remind us of what I might call the technology of spirituality. I know this is a bit of a tactic to call it a technology. We can get into that if you're curious. Because spiritual practices might remind us of grounding and situating ourselves, recognizing that we are in the here and now. We have an awareness that's connected to our presence, right? And there's many, many traditions. I mean, they're all around. They remind us of this. They remind us that we do not need to live in mirror worlds. It's time to get back to life, right? You know, as the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky said once, what's the purpose of life? I remember in one of his movies he was asked, what's the purpose of life? And then the answer is life. Life might be the purpose of life. So let's go back to Naomi Klein here. I'm going to quote here from one thing she says in Doppelganger. Our role here on Earth is not simply to maximize the advantage in our lives, meaning our individual lives. It's to maximize, protect, and regenerate all of life. We are here not just to make sure we as individuals survive, but to make sure that life survives. Not to chase clout or power, but to chase life. So what I wanted to just do here, and I attempted to, was give you a range of different examples, not of some sort of naive optimism, oh, there's some blogger here in this place who wrote this cool thing, but actually real technologies that are bridging, that are relating, rather than containing, individuating, or placing us essentially in invisible prisons. And I think it's high time we go there, and I'm dedicated to doing it. So let's have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. Wow, so much to unpack. So I have the honor of taking the stage here with you and coordinating the Q&A. I, of course, brought a couple of questions just having heard your talk now myself, but I don't want to monopolize, so I'm going to look out for your hands going up, and we've got microphones going around. So we'll take one question there first, and then I'll pop in one if that's okay. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Matt. I'm a social media editor at the YouTube channel Kurzgesagt. I want to thank you for your talk. I think it was fascinating. I also thought you articulated, especially in a climate where we talk a lot about the rise of the right, we often forget the kind of decline of a classical left-wing and liberal side of our governments and political parties who represent us. In a world where it's difficult to build coalition between people who want to find solidarity with one another, what would you recommend as a policy at a government level or an international level to increase solidarity among people who consider themselves broadly on the left?
I really appreciate that question. Thank you. So I think I'm like agnostic about levers of change. You know, I mean, I'm believe it or not, I'm very much a pragmatist. I worked for this Bernie Sanders campaign on digital rights policy. I worked on gig economy policy. I work with people in the U.S. Congress, but usually they're people who get this stuff, right? So I think there's a lot of different levers of change, and I wouldn't say I'm like optimistic about it, but I do think it's important to identify what those are, just like I try to identify different kinds of ways we can take technology back, right? So first of all, social movements have always been the basis of huge amounts of change, but they often have to get either somewhat institutionalized or transformed into some sort of policy. I mean, I speak for this as someone who's protested, you know, Iraq War, Black Lives Matter, I mean, just, you can name it, Occupy, all of these things, right? And I know that, and was in the middle of the Arab Spring. I mean, not as a participant, though I was in solidarity with that movement, big time. I think movements can change, but the problem is, and this is something I saw firsthand in Egypt, is what comes, you know, once you can take out a certain kind of at least, you know, figurehead of power, like Hosni Mubarak, right? What comes next, right? And I think that's the key thing that movements have to identify. You know, we are profoundly frustrated in the United States about the murders that are being committed by the cops, especially in black and brown people, but especially black people, right? We're profoundly frustrated about that. I don't know about everybody, but I am. And all of us who protested, yet we're also profoundly frustrated that nothing happened, that no policy went through, right? We're so frustrated about that. Trust me, we feel very powerless and voiceless about what's happening in Gaza right now. Many of us. I have students who are having in encampments. So that's a long way of saying activism and social movements, but there has to be sort of like, not an end game, but like I wouldn't call it an institutionalization, but something that emerges, that's specific and kind of either legislative or something like that. So I think that's one. A lot of activism, amazing activism, is coming from my friends who work in tech companies. I went to Stanford in the late 90s. I have, I don't know if I call them friends, but people I were in classes with who started PayPal, who are like bazillionaires. I'm not kidding. It's really weird. But it's, I see them at the reunions and stuff. And sometimes people working in these companies are heroes too. I've seen a number of people at Google and Amazon protest Project Nimbus, which is cloud services that are being provided to the IDF right now. I have to speak about it. I mean, I know people don't want to talk about it, but I have to. So it's sort of like this is another lever of change, right? But most importantly, we have to figure out ways to take out institutionalized corrupted power that claims liberalism. Toward like real vocality, right? And that's the thing that's happened in the US and why a lot of us are pretty depressed about the situation, because we don't really feel any of them represent us. And all of us who worked with Bernie tried to enact these changes in whatever ways we can. So I think it's policy, it's activism, it's movements, but always an awareness of counterpower, counter-hit, that there's always counterpower. We're counterpower, but our power can be counter too. And I also think it's about approaching people in a way that's not necessarily dehumanizing or antagonistic. I don't think I'm better than anybody. I just don't, I don't think that a human being who might work for the State Department is inherently a horrible human being. I don't like the State Department right now, especially, but I also think that way. So I think that's also part of the practice, is moving beyond the borders of judgment and dehumanization. And, honestly, some of the fragmentation that's occurred with the left.
Thank you. Let's see if we can have a couple more questions. I'm going to pop one in, and I've seen you next, and then I've seen you. So maybe we can try to keep a short Q&A going for those. Maybe quickly, Ramesh, it builds on this concept of how do we democratize, how to create a fairer playing field. So linking on to this first question, we're putting so many emphasis on innovation in our society today, but the playing field is becoming less and less level. Power concentration, you touched resource scarcity, chip wars, you touched on some of these things, and yet we're still speaking about innovation as like what's going to save us from climate change, what's going to, advance humanity. And yet this idea of this sort of US rags and riches based idea that you can start up as a little startup and sort of gain the big tech level, that's becoming pretty impossible just because of like affordability of data capacity. We see it in the AI world so much. How do we move into looking at this whole wonderful world of grassroots innovation that you shared, and the idea that small tech is beautiful, local tech is beautiful? How do we create a more level playing field for innovation, again, looking at the extreme power concentration that we're facing today?
So it's a few things. First, I think most importantly, people need to be protected economically amidst these changes and transformations. And that's not, universal basic income is a real start, but it's not good enough because it doesn't change the levers of an extractive system. There are a number of other proposals that are, I would say, even more interesting, like data unions is an interesting thing. Unions should be bargaining for our data rights and make sure people are compensated. Or even equity people can have in data grabbing corporations, right? Everyone probably knows this, but the internet started through taxpayer funding on my campus at UCLA. And none of these technologies are worth anything without our data, right? So people should be compensated for that, or the levers that actually accumulate so much value, even this boogeyman way without profitability that I was talking about, can also be changed. I also think we need to identify what work of the future will look like, or economic security will look like in the future. And here's a huge one. It's always been shown that small businesses and certainly business, other kinds of economic forms like cooperatives or other kinds of mixed types of organizations employ way more people. So we have to decide, I think the decision is this about, as Bernie believes still, everybody should get a job, there should be a jobs guarantee. This is kind of classic democratic socialist. For you guys, it's not that left, but for us, it's amazing. And honestly, is it that, or is it 32-hour work week? We have to decide, but most importantly, human beings should be protected, and that should be a human right. And that should be a critical component of all of this. So incentivizing small business, medium-sized businesses, thinking about policy proposals that support these amazing entrepreneurs, grassroots figures in these markets, for example, what if we applied Creative Commons to devices? That same model of creative reuse of technology, right? Rather than criminalization of it. So there's just a ton of, I think, economic proposals that can shift these levers and have network effects.
That is a hopeful future I think many of us here would like to aspire to. Caroline, let's have your question, and then the one in the front row pooled, and then we'll try to give a quick answer in the time we've got left. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Geraldine. Also, we know each other from the smart city context, and I actually want to land your planetary consciousness within a kind of city context. And I think what we've been seeing working on the ground, working in policy, working at these intersections that you also propose, is that we actually have to fundamentally change how we see ownership and how we actually deal with natural resources as a kind of constraint within environments that suggest us that human imagination can extend any kind of natural boundary. But actually bounding it, bringing it back, constraining it, I think my question to you is how can we bring these models and also the great work that Geraldine is doing like within a kind of planetary, how shall I say, different planetary context, how can we bring that back into communities that right now don't feel yet the kind of constraint and have a kind of restriction on how to share, how to repair, how to reuse resources in a kind of more cycling way?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly is the... Oh.
Should we just pull them quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Is that okay? We'll take one last one up here. And then you have to give a quick answer. Just really short, please.
Also, Dagmar, associated with DW and Agile Coach. My question is pretty simple. What would you name a common platform so everything, all the initiatives, good organization can be seen and spread? Could it be a public broadcaster, or what's your take on that?
I think these are really connected questions. Thank you both for them. I think that a lot of, we need to ensure that a lot of resources are in some sort of commons. I think that's a key part of it. That a number of different resources, like, for example, digital infrastructure, could be more publicly owned or at least publicly governed, right? That's one key thing. And then there can be offshoots emerging from that could be, corporate actors, but it doesn't have to be dominated not just by corporate actors, but actors that have dominated and taken over any notion of a free market, right? So I think this is a key kind of issue. The economist, as I'm sure you're familiar, Elinor Ostrom did a lot of work on this back in the day, right? A female Nobel Prize winner. So all right, I think that's point one. I know I got to go fast. I think the point two is just really, like rolling back the kind of total immunity that big tech companies have to basically Pac-Man everything. Like Pac-Man, right? I think that's the key, is kind of situating them and restricting them in certain ways, and then opening up a lot of other spheres for digital activity, to including repair and so on, as you were asking about, to grassroots actors. And I do agree with you that maybe people here don't yet feel the pangs of these inequalities and scarcities, but in the US they're already feeling them. This is really directly tied to the rise of neo-fascism in the US, right? So, I mean, so you don't feel it now, you'll feel it soon, right? So it's sort of like it's time to kind of for a true reinvestment in something that's more public and commons-based, where people can actually enact their creativity to do cool things with technologies of all kinds to support one another. And I do think that possibility is available and accessible to us, but it's not going to come from just being excited that one person here or there does something cool on social media. That's not good enough. But it's also not going to come from saying it's all apocalyptic, all algorithms are oppressive. That's not going to get us anywhere either.
Thank you for the great questions, and thank you for dealing with all these complex topics in such a short time. Let's have a big round of applause for you, please. Thanks.